We switched from buongiorno to buonasera, so I'll say buonasera. Welcome to Michelangelo's Italy. My name is Gene Openshaw. I'm the co-author of several of the Rick Steves guidebooks. I'd like to say a special welcome to our virtual audience, the people that are watching this live streaming on Facebook. So to you folks out in cyberspace, thanks for joining us. Can I just start by asking, how many people have had the opportunity to actually go to Italy and seen some of Michelangelo's works? Good, good. How many are currently planning a trip? Good. How many are keeping one eye on the Dow Jones? Let's leave those mundane things behind us and enter Michelangelo's Italy. Michelangelo Buonarroti is considered one of our greatest artists, if not the greatest, and with good reason. He was accomplished in many fields. First and foremost, as a sculptor, creating some of our most memorable images. Statues that people will recognize even if they don't know anything about art. But he's probably equally well known as a painter, working on a monumental scale. As an architect, his work has influenced countless generations. He was also a poet, fairly well known. In short, a Renaissance man. So much so, so famous, such an icon, that we sometimes forget that this great artist was also an ordinary Italian who lived in very much the same Italy that we go and experience today. He would have traveled through the same diverse landscape. There was a request. Does anyone need the house lights down to see a little bit better? Okay. Thank you. Are you a sound technician? Yeah. Good. Thank you for the... Thank you, yeah. Michelangelo also would have walked through ruins of history that stretched back thousands of years. He would have prayed in the same churches that locals do today, been a tourist and traveled to exotic destinations in Italy, admiring the great work of his predecessors, and enjoying Italian food. In short, he was an everyday Italian, part of the rhythm of everyday Italian life and of ordinary Italians. Or are these the Sopranos? Well, what I would like to do today is to trace the arc, the long arc, 90 years almost, of Michelangelo's life, taking you to some of the places where he created, where he lived, worked, created some of the masterpieces that we see today. I know that not everyone that goes to Italy is going to be quite the museum wonk that I am, but even on a casual trip to Italy, you're going to encounter Michelangelo's work. I want to make sure that you all got a copy of this handout here. No need to follow along during my show, but it lists on there some of the artwork that you're going to see, the museum that you'll find it in, and a few sightseeing tips to avoid crowds. Well, let's start Michelangelo's journey. Michelangelo was born in Florence, the heart of Italy. He lived more than half his life there, but he also spent significant time in Rome, as well as lesser stays in Siena, Carrara, Bologna, Venice. To give you an idea of scale, from Florence to Rome is 180 miles, Seattle to Portland. That's like 2 hours on the train, 3 hours by car, or 3 to 4 days on horse, as Michelangelo would have traveled it. Well, let's begin in his hometown of Florence. The skyline of Florence looks very much like it might have in Michelangelo's day. The main church, called the Duomo, with its distinctive red and white dome, the medieval tower of the town hall, and the Arno River. Michelangelo grew up right in the thick of it, right about 2 blocks behind the town hall. And that's where we begin his journey, right here, at this rather inauspicious place. Amid the graffiti, the plumbing, the electrical cables, Luigi's undershorts, you see this plaque, which tells us that this is the casa, the house, where Michelangelo, born in nearby Caprese, spent his childhood. Back then, it was a kind of working class neighborhood, and it still is today, a place where Florentines, the university students, park their motorinos just outside the tourist zone. As a child, little Mikey was a dreamer. His dad wanted him to be a city bureaucrat, but Michelangelo wanted to be an artist. One day, his father caught him sketching when he should have been studying. His father literally tried to beat the art out of him. When that didn't work, plan B. They arranged a job for young Michelangelo, working for an artist who was painting this chapel across town. It was menial, blue-collar work for 13-year-old Michelangelo, but there were a few glimpses. Ghirlandaio, the master, would occasionally job out little details to his assistants. Hey, Marco, paint me some jewels on this dress. Hey, Francesco, paint me a mountain. Hey, Michelangelo, you do young men's butts. And it's said that 13-year-old Michelangelo painted these 3 figures as realistic as anything in Ghirlandaio's fresco cycle. Well, in 1494, Michelangelo's life took a Dickensian turn. He was plucked from obscurity by none other than the ruler of Florence, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who recognized his talent and invited him into the Medici household to study art and the classics. Suddenly, Michelangelo was living in the best palace in town, the Medici Palace, living among future popes and princes and dining with Europe's most distinguished guests. Florence, in the 1400s, was the very center of the Renaissance, that cultural phenomenon that was the rebirth of the learning and arts of ancient Greece and Rome. Florence, here's a map of Florence. The Arno River runs roughly east-west through the city, and it's on the north bank that most of the sites are, clustered around the main church or Duomo. Michelangelo lived with the Medici in what's now called the Medici Riccardi Palace. Let's take a walk through Michelangelo's Florence, from his palace, past the Duomo, down the main street to the Arno. If you ever get lost, the Dome is home. The main church, the Duomo, would have been for Michelangelo practically a museum of great art that he could admire. He would have stood in the front there and looked at the work done by the 3 generations before him, the people that had invented the Renaissance. So, first and foremost, the Dome, built by Filippo Brunelleschi, an engineering feat that even surpassed that of the ancients. On the facade, he would have seen works by Donatello that recalled ancient Greece and Rome, and works that inspired Michelangelo's own style. Turning 180 degrees from the Duomo, he'd see the baptistry with its bronze doors, where Lorenzo Ghiberti had made these 3-dimensional scenes on a virtual 2-dimensional surface, inspiring the painters of the Renaissance. As you head down Florence's main street, you realize it's a very modern city today, about 400,000 people, and they kind of go about their everyday business almost oblivious to these masterpieces that stand around them. So Donatello's St. George, gazes proudly across at modern shop displays. Florence today is actually a very trendy boutique shopping town, just as it would have been in Michelangelo's day. A few steps farther along, you reach what was the town hall, the Palazzo Vecchio, where the Medici family had their offices. And then just beyond that, the Arno River. Florence sat at a crossroads of trade, the east-west trade along the Arno, and the north-south trade along the main highway that connected Rome and northern Europe. It was always a cosmopolitan center, the perfect place to birth the Renaissance. Think of the world that Michelangelo grew up in. We think of the Renaissance as being just great artists, but there are also people like Christopher Columbus discovering new worlds. So think of it. Michelangelo knew Leonardo da Vinci. They competed together in a painting contest. Leonardo, in his youth, had been a musician, playing lute at parties attended by Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo's son grew up to be Pope Leo X. Leo X had to contend with the radical politician Niccolò Machiavelli of Florence. Machiavelli's writings were much admired by another cunning politician, King Henry VIII of England. Henry VIII considered himself a writer and wrote a treatise condemning the heresies of Martin Luther of Germany. Martin Luther befriended the artist Albrecht Dürer, whose works were admired by Pope Leo X, who excommunicated Martin Luther. The Renaissance was blossoming all over Europe, but the very epicenter of that movement was Florence and the Medici Palace. Teenage Michelangelo, age 16, began to create his first works. This is one of his first ones, done when he was 15, 16, 17. It's fully classical, looks like ancient Greece or Rome. Celebration of the naked human form, a mythological scene. It's pagan and earthy and secular. Contrast that with another work that he was working on at the very same time. This Madonna is Christian and understated and humble. Those two philosophical poles, the pagan, the earthy, the classical, and the Christian, the faith-centered, the understated, those two poles would dominate Michelangelo's work and his life and personality through all of his years. In 1494, Michelangelo's life took another turn. Florence came under the sway of a charismatic monk, this man here, Girolamo Savonarola, who preached fire and brimstone sermons condemning the pagan Renaissance. His followers threw the Medici from power, literally ransacked and vandalized the Medici palace. Michelangelo, still just a teenager, was guilty by association and suddenly found himself homeless. For the next few years, he would roam Italy in search of his fortune. The works from this time show the wide variety of his experimental and emerging style. This decadent Bacchus that he did for a nobleman in Rome. A dreamy Madonna done for a faraway church in Belgium. A stately St. Paul for an altarpiece in Siena. A Holy Family for a rich merchant in Tuscany. And this statue that first put Michelangelo on the map, a Pietà showing Mary, the mother of Christ, cradling her dead son in her lap, having been taken down from the cross. Michelangelo was just in his early 20s when he sculpted this, and it was displayed for Holy Year 1500 in Old St. Peter's. Tens of thousands of pilgrims filed by. They were amazed at how this young sculptor could have such understated emotion and create a heavenly scene with such human realism. Eventually, Michelangelo was free to return to Florence, and there he took on his next challenge. They asked him to sculpt a figure from a 17-foot-high block of marble. 17 feet. Wow. Something like that, I'm thinking. 17 feet. Not only that, the block of marble was flawed and was considered too narrow to accommodate a realistic human figure. Michelangelo took on the challenge. He put it behind screens for privacy while he worked, picked up his hammer and chisel, knocked a knot off what would become the statue's heart, and started work. For the next 2 years, he carved out a story from the Bible of the shepherd boy that slew the giant. The story goes that David turned down the armor of the day. Instead, he went to the river and collected 5 smooth stones that he cups in his powerful right hand. He throws his sling over his left shoulder and goes out onto the field of battle. And Michelangelo captures him at the exact moment he's gazing across the battlefield, sizing up the enemy and saying to himself, I can take this guy. When the screens came down, the Florentines were amazed. They claimed the statue as their own, a symbol of the city. They tied ropes to it and dragged it across wooden rollers down the streets. Imagine the engineering challenge of this. You got a statue that's 17 feet tall, weighs 12,000 pounds, top heavy, with virtually all of the weight balanced on one fragile right ankle. Thousands of Michelangelo maniacs lined the streets as they brought it into the main square in town, where they set it up right at the most prominent place in front of the entrance to the town hall, where the fake David stands today. For the Florentines of the time, David seemed to represent them. They were Renaissance men and women, enlightened people, slaying the giant of medieval ignorance and superstition. And in some ways, David may be a metaphor for Michelangelo himself at this point. Lean and muscular with the body of David, but not the face. Michelangelo was ugly. He had a bent nose all his life that had been broken in a fight. But it caught his spirit. At age 30, Michelangelo was now at the top of his sculpting powers, confident, ready to take on the world. When he was at the top of his game as a sculptor, he was suddenly forced to make a career change, to pick up a painter's brush instead of a sculptor's chisel. The call came from none other than the Pope in Rome. The Pope asked him to paint his chapel, the Sistine Chapel, the private chapel of the popes at the Vatican. It was a huge undertaking, so Michelangelo had a suitably huge vision for it. He wanted to paint the entire history of the world, from the first day of creation up to the coming of Christ, 300 figures. It's a lot to take in at once, so let's kind of get oriented. Let me show you a diagram of the ceiling. The ceiling looks something kind of like this. It's composed of 3 elements: a central spine of scenes from the Bible. Flanking those are prophets on thrones. And in between those, these triangular things, these lunettes, that feature the ancestors of Christ. The story begins right here in this panel with the first day of creation. God separates the light from the darkness, beginning creation. As you go up the central spine there, you see the other acts of creation. You see God bringing forth dry land, God creating man, God creating woman. Keep going up, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And you keep going up and you get to the stories of Noah and the flood. Now, flanking that central spine then are prophets sitting on thrones, both Old Testament prophets and pagan prophetesses from ancient Greece, the Delphic oracle, who Michelangelo and his people thought also prophesied the coming of Christ. And then inside those, the lunettes, where the ancestors of Christ patiently await his coming. There was a fourth element that Michelangelo added. Amid all of this fake architecture and fake statues that he did are these figures, these naked figures, the so-called ignudi or nudes. These seem to have no thematic purpose, simply a celebration of the naked male body, exuding the pagan spirit of the Renaissance here in Christendom's most holy chapel. Picture Michelangelo preparing to paint this thing, standing 6 stories up on scaffolding, looking at his big blank canvas. It was 12,000 square feet, both the upper walls here and the ceiling. Michelangelo did the ceiling with his own hand, about half of the job. Huge undertaking, and where did it all start? Right here, in Michelangelo's fertile brain. He would get an idea, maybe a face, pick up a piece of paper and a stick of chalk, and start sketching some lines and some hatching, a nose, a mouth, a fleeting emotion, some wind-blown hair. This face, where would it go? And then he thinks, well, maybe I'll make that face part of this figure here. The face of this figure clinging to a tree. Great idea. But remember, though, that Michelangelo was painting this in fresco, which is painting on wet plaster. So, first they'd have to haul all the materials up the scaffolding. They'd have to sand and prepare the ceiling. They'd have to mix the plaster. They'd have to trowel it on. And then while it's still wet, Michelangelo would have to work quickly to get it finished before it dried and locked the colors in. If they got it wrong, they just have to scrape that section off and start all over again. It was a big undertaking, and this face would have been just one tiny element of what eventually became a larger scene. Noah and the flood. Here's Noah's Ark in the background. Now, it's often thought that Michelangelo painted lying down, but he painted standing up, reaching up, bending backwards. If you've ever futzed with a light fixture for even 5 minutes, you know how tiring that can be for your hands, for your arms. And then all of that work took him 2 months just to do this scene here. He could probably do about this much in a day. Maybe it's about this big. Something like that. Piecing together these little pieces. 2 months it took him to do the flood, and yet the flood is only a drop in the flood of the ceiling. It's way up here now. Just one scene among many. It took Michelangelo 4 long years to do the Sistine ceiling. The physical effort, paint dripping in his eyes, and most of all, the mental stress of dealing with a pushy pope. He claimed that it nearly killed him. But when it was finally done, and they took the scaffolding down, and the pope and his court came in to look, it just blew him away. They'd never seen anything like it before. It seemed like they could look up and see into heaven itself, watching God at work in his creation. And the central scene of the whole thing was the central act of creation. God swoops in with his entourage to create man. He reaches across to pass the divine spark of life to his creation. And Adam, receives it looking back, making meaningful eye contact with God, almost like they're on the same plane. Adam receives that spark of life, that creative force, and then he goes on to continue God's creation on earth. What a humanist statement. With the Sistine ceiling, it was showing God almost like a loving father passing the baton to the next generation. Michelangelo had summed up the optimistic spirit of the times. He topped the work of all other painters. And when you go to Italy and you stand under the Sistine Chapel and see that expansive ceiling, you can appreciate the agony of the process and the ecstasy of the result. Now, when I go to Italy and I see these masterpieces done by these enlightened people of yore, it always leaves me feeling inspired and invigorated. But as many of you know who have traveled, sightseeing is very hard work. So let's take a little break from our art sightseeing and do a little different sightseeing, Italian cuisine. If America's specialty is fast food, Italy's is slow food. So you build a meal, you buy your figs from Sophia Loren, you buy your meats from the butcher, you buy your breads from the baker. You basically shop by walking around the block, greeting shopkeepers that you may have known all of your life. You buy foods in season. If you're making a journey in the next month or two, you may find artichokes on the menu. The food is prepared with love and always eaten in social circumstances. For Italians, an evening's entertainment is not necessarily dinner and a movie. It's just dinner. Leisurely meal, a multi-course meal with your friends. Italians do eat in courses. Your first course might be antipasto. Then that's just the start of a full meal. Next comes your pasta course. Then your main dish, your meat dish. Then your salad course. Then your dessert, your coffee, your liqueur, the cigarette course. But of course, food is only half of the equation of Italian cuisine, the other half being wine. If you go to Italy, I would say it's compulsory that you try the wines. You got your Chianti from the region of Tuscany. You got your Bartolinos from the north, Lacrima Christi from the south. There's a wine for every wine connoisseur. By the way, Michelangelo's favorite wine was a white wine made from the Trebbiano grape. If you want to try a little Vino di Michelangelo, pick yourself up a dry, crisp white like an Orvieto Classico. That would have been one he would have enjoyed. Well, our meal is almost done. Time to do a little more sightseeing. But first, I like to end my meal with a little dessert. Nothing better than gelato. Italian ice cream, the best in the world. It's made from a little less milk fat, so the natural flavors can come through. Almost every place in Italy has got at least one gelateria, a little 31 flavors establishment where you can buy homemade ice cream on the premises. So grab yourself a cup or a cone and join the rest of the Italians on the evening passeggiata as they walk the streets, greet their neighbors, and enjoy a slice of edible art. When we finish here, I would be glad to talk to you about your trip or answer questions, but I can't do it here, so I will meet you in the Travel Center, which is 2 blocks south of here. While you're there, I hope that you'll kind of peruse some of our products and services which can help your trip. The best one is arm yourself with information. Now, there are 3 main Michelangelo sites, and all 3 of them come with big crowds. You'll want to find ways to avoid waiting in line to buy tickets for what can be an hour, 2 hours, maybe more in the hot sun. And those lines and crowds are pretty much all the time from April through October, and even sometimes in the off-season. So you want to find ways to avoid that. In Florence, to see David, the Accademia is the museum you go to. It has long lines, but they can be avoided by simply making a reservation, reserving an entry time. That can be done very easily online, on the phone with an English-speaking operator, or even through your hotel. Another option that's been added just recently is the Florence card. This is a 3-day sightseeing pass that covers most of the museums of Florence and allows you to go straight to the head of the line. It's a great deal, ultra convenient, but it's also a little bit pricier. So check, get a guidebook and see how much you're going to use that pass and whether that's the route to go. In Rome, to see the Sistine Chapel, that's part of the Vatican Museum tour. So you want to go online to the Vatican Museum website and book yourself a reservation time. You print off the confirmation, you go right there, you bypass all of those people waiting in a 2-hour line and go, what a bunch of losers. And you walk right up to the other place with no line at all, hand them your voucher, and they let you right in. And for St. Peter's, although there's no fee to get into St. Peter's, there is usually a long line to get through security. We found out a way to avoid that, which is a special backdoor exit from the Sistine Chapel that leads directly to St. Peter's. So if you've got this white, this white sheet of mine, I did list these 3 options very briefly, as well as a few other things on it. Check that out, and you'll want to get a little more detail from a guidebook. The point that I really want to make about all this is I really want you to spend a lot of money here today at Europe Through the Back Door. Of course I don't. I don't want to push a bunch of crap on you, but a little bit of, but the right things can really help. Don't be what the British call penny wise but pound foolish, where you're pinching pennies here trying to save money and missing the big picture. Look, you're spending literally thousands of dollars for this trip. Be willing to spend a few dozen dollars up front for the kinds of things that can save you money down the line, save you time, enrich your experience, and make your trip, your very expensive trip, exactly what you want it to be. The one thing that I will mention is this book here, Europe 101. Rick Steves and I wrote this book to try to bring Europe's history and art to life for the traveler. It talks through Europe's history and is illustrated with the very masterpieces that you're going to Europe to see. This can be very helpful, so consider that. And if you are, I'm actually doing a slideshow on Europe 101 2 weeks from today here in Edmonds at the Edmonds Movie Theater. So it's similar to my Michelangelo show. If you like that, come where I treat European history and art in very much the same way, with many of the very same jokes. If you're going to do any shopping, the final word I'm going to say here is do it here today at the Travel Center until 6 o'clock. Why? Because everything is 20% off. For those that are our friends in cyberspace that are watching on the Facebook stream, that also applies to you. You get 20% off the price when you're shopping online until 6 p.m. Pacific time. End of commercial, thank you. Let's go back to Michelangelo's life. We left Michelangelo where? We left him at the peak of his career. The triumph of David, the triumph of the Sistine Chapel. He was now famous. The commissions poured in for other works, a pope's tomb, a church facade. He would need a mountain of marble to sculpt all of those things. So where did he go? To the mother lode of marble. And that's where we head next, the mountains of Carrara. Carrara quarries many different kinds of marble, but its specialty is pure white. That is, without the impurities that give marble its color. In Carrara, it's not just statues that are white. Heck, the streets are literally paved with marble. And even the humblest of establishments might have a sign for made out of Carrara marble. Michelangelo, in 1516, settled in this flat in the town of Carrara, right next to where today the locals come for their morning cappuccino and newspaper. The plaque over the door tells us many times, più volte, Michelangelo came here to bring his creations to life from the marble of our living mountains. From the town of Carrara, you then look up into those mountains, and you see these snow-capped peaks. Oh, wait, sorry, these aren't snow-capped peaks. You realize this is the white exposed rock from the quarries. To get there, you go up steep switchback hills to what are now still working quarries. And you can gaze across at the sheer face that has been carved out with these big blocks of marble. Looks kind of like you're looking at an opera amphitheater with box seats, but big enough that could seat literally thousands of Davids. You look down below at the bottom, and you see these tiny men and machines going along, and you realize the enormity of the scale of quarrying marble. In Michelangelo's day, it was much more arduous work. Workers had to dangle down on the sheer rock face, kind of try to work a little crack into the face. Then they would pound in wooden wedges. They'd pour water on the wedges, causing them to expand, and it would calve off these big chunks of marble. Then workers would saw through them like lumberjacks laboriously to cut them into more manageable sizes. These blocks would then be stacked on a sledge, a wooden sled, that they could slide down the hillsides. Men and oxen hung on almost for dear life as they brought them down these steep hills. Michelangelo even lost one of his men one time in an accident. They bring them down to the town of Carrara, where even today they stack them ready for transport. Well, after 4 years, Michelangelo had amassed many, many tons of marble. He put some on a barge and sailed it up the Arno River to his hometown. And there he'd been asked to do a marvelous new project. He was going to create dozens of colossal-sized statues, the size of David, and put them on the facade, a gleaming marble facade of a church. And here it is. Unfinished. The Church of San Lorenzo in Florence remains bare brick to this day. And in fact, this was only the first of a number of projects that Michelangelo worked on and left unfinished. A couple of decades of work where things kind of kept getting put by the wayside. From the Church of San Lorenzo, unfinished, you go just around the corner where you could find the Laurentian Library, which he also began, designed, and left unfinished. It was completed after his death. The statues known as the slaves, intended for a pope's tomb, left unfinished. These statues, the slaves or prisoners, you'll find when you visit David, they line the hall leading up to David. They seem to be struggling to free themselves from the marble. It's kind of good that these were left unfinished, because these statues give us an insight into Michelangelo's sculpting process. You may have heard, and it is true, that he would say he wasn't creating the figure, he was just discovering the figure that God had put into the marble, the form that God had put in the marble. That's form with a capital F for all of the Neoplatonists in the audience. Just across town, another project, the Medici tombs, unfinished, the Medici chapels. These were tombs that Michelangelo was making for the Medici family, people he'd grown up with and were now dying around him. It's a kind of grim place. And you look at some of these statues and they kind of twist and squirm restlessly, like they're pondering their mortality but unable to come to terms with it. Now in his 50s, Michelangelo sank into a deep midlife crisis. Oh wait, that's me. Sorry. And I don't want to, overanalyze Michelangelo or psychoanalyze him, but if you read his writings from this time, it's very clear the many references he makes to how time is passing him by. He feels overworked, stressed, trapped, and most of all, old. In the autumn of 1529, Michelangelo suddenly walked away from it all these projects that were in the works. Without telling anyone, he left Florence and went on a little trip. He went someplace that many people go when they need to heal wounds or recharge their batteries. He went where there is warm sun and sea breezes, and that's where we head next, to the island city of Venice. Engineers love Venice, a completely man-made environment that seems to rise from the sea with no visible means of support. Venice is an island shaped like a fish that sits about 2 miles off the Italian mainland. These days it's connected to the mainland by a bridge that brings in car and train traffic. But for us, let's enter the city the way Michelangelo would have, on boat, down the Grand Canal to the historic center, St. Mark's Square. These days you ride on a kind of water bus called a vaporetto. You immediately see that the city looks like it did way back when. The Grand Canal is grand, 2.25 miles long, 150 feet wide, about 10 feet deep in most places, and lined with palazzos and churches, just as it would have been in Michelangelo's day. You go underneath Rialto Bridge, where there was the marketplace. Venice, in its heyday, ruled the global economy. It was the middleman in trade between the raw materials of Western Europe and the luxury goods of the Eastern lands. We arrived then at Piazza San Marco, St. Mark's Square, dominated by the church with its bell tower, its clock tower, and the Doge's palace, where the prince or doge of Venice ruled this worldwide economic empire. St. Mark's Square is one of the world's great gathering places. These things along the side here, these chairs and tables, these are cafes. Each one has its own cafe orchestra. It's wonderful. For the price of what here in the States you might pay for like a movie and popcorn and Diet Coke, you could have a seat at one of these cafe tables, sip a glass of Valpolicella wine, admire the Byzantine architecture of the church, and listen while the band plays New York, New York. Hey, if all you did was plunk yourself down in St. Mark's Square and watch the world go by, to me that's a vacation. It's not hard in Venice to blink away elements of the modern world and find yourself transported in time back to, say, the centuries of not just Michelangelo, but of Giacomo Casanova, real-life Venetian. Seeing people going about their timeless activities, people who are going to the marketplace just as generations have done at that same place for millennia. In Michelangelo's day, Venice was Europe's fun city, a place where nobles would come, don a mask for anonymity, and do the kinds of things in Venice that they were forbidden to do back home. I can't exactly tell you what Michelangelo did during his time in Venice, not everything at least. He probably did the same kinds of things that people do today. There are two things in the historical record. One, he spend a lot of money in a short amount of time. And second, he wrote poetry, love poetry, and his career as a poet began. "Love has taken me captive," he wrote, "and beauty holds me bound." He sees his beloved everywhere, her beautiful face in every statue. Love leaves him dangling in the middle between reality and hope, robbed of peace, sighing and consumed with a burning fire. Michelangelo was a homosexual, but exactly who he had sex with, if anyone, is a mystery to historians. He seemed to be a man married only to his art, who saw love as a platonic force for good. But around this time, historians seem to think Michelangelo did fall in love with a young man 40 years his junior in Rome, named Tommaso Cavalieri. They often point to this statue that Michelangelo was working on and see Cavalieri's graceful, handsome figures in the young man standing here. Michelangelo sent Cavalieri passionate letters, erotic sketches, love poems. And they see in the statue as something of a metaphor of their relationship. A handsome young man standing triumphant over an older man whose face clearly resembles Michelangelo, a man who is clearly the young man's conquest. In 1534, Michelangelo reinvented himself once more. He decided to leave Florence. He packed up his belongings and closed his studio. He left and told his friends, "I shall not return," and he never did. Now 60 years old, he headed south, where he would start the final chapter of his life in the city of Rome. Rome is the eternal city, with history everywhere. Layers, old and new, side by side. So you might see a line of these motorinos from the 21st century lined up against a 2nd century temple. In Rome, you might see an Egyptian obelisk atop a Baroque elephant in front of a Gothic church, where images of the Christian God are patterned on those of a pagan priest. Rome is the world of the Baroque and the broken, with Mussolini's balcony of Il Duce and an overpriced shoe store named Gucci. Is it just me, or are the jokes getting worse? I think so. Well, Michelangelo, amid all this history, added his own layer, Renaissance Rome. First up, the Sistine Chapel. Remember, 25 years before, he'd painted the ceiling. Now he was asked to come and finish the job painting the altar wall. He'd painted the history of the world from the creation to the coming of Christ, and now he finished it by painting the end of time, the Last Judgment. Da-da-da-da, the angels blow their trumpets, waking the dead rise from their graves to be judged. The good rise up to Christ in heaven, while the wicked are dragged down into hell to be tormented by demons for eternity. It's really a grim scene. Look at this guy here. Obviously a sinner going, why did I cheat on my wife with my housekeeper? It's very grim. Even Christ is not a love thy neighbor Jesus anymore. He's come for justice. Out of the 390 figures, not one is smiling, not even the blessed in heaven. And in fact, it matched Michelangelo's mood and the mood of all of Europe. The Renaissance was ending. They were embroiled in the religious wars of the Reformation, and Michelangelo found himself a Renaissance man in counter-Reformation times. Very different sort of world as he's painting all these naked figures. Take a look at this. This is actually a copy of his work, of The Last Judgment, done by an artist of the time. It shows how Michelangelo originally painted these figures, virtually all of them, butt naked, in all their classical glory. A few decades later, prudish church officials would hire another artist to come in and clothe these with little loincloths. That's the version that we see today. Michelangelo himself was becoming more pessimistic about mankind, more introspective. And you can see it in one final detail he added. Right next to Christ is this saint here, and he's holding a flayed skin in his hand. You zero in and you see that skin has a face in it. Clearly a self-portrait of a troubled and self-doubting Michelangelo. Before I finish with our very final years of Michelangelo's life, let me just remind you, when we finish here, I'll meet you in the travel center. Go there, spend a lot of money until 6 o'clock. If you're interested in a Rick Steves tour, Heidi is giving a talk at 5 o'clock today at the Edmonds Theater on Italy tours. I hope I see some of you 2 weeks from today for a talk on Europe 101. And again, just on behalf of everybody that's spoken today, thanks for coming to our travel festival. Now let's hit the final years of Michelangelo's life. In his last years, Michelangelo's works turn religious and faith-centered. Scenes like the conversion of St. Paul or the crucifixion of St. Peter, not happy scenes celebrating humankind in their confidence, but concentrating more on our grim mortality. This late Pietà, Michelangelo whittled Christ down to an emaciated figure, an ethereal, otherworldly presence. And this late Pietà that Michelangelo intended for his own tomb. You look at the dead Christ and you look up at the figures of Nicodemus up here, and it's clearly a self-portrait of an aging Michelangelo looking down on what he fears might be his final sculptures. Michelangelo in his last years turned more to architecture, and it is this that is one of his greatest legacies. At age 70, he was asked by the Pope to take over the ongoing construction of new St. Peter's Basilica. For the next 2 decades, Michelangelo worked on this project, making many designs that were incorporated in it, completing a lot of it, being one of many architects over about 120 years to work on this church. You go inside, it's overwhelming. First of all, just the sheer size of it, but also the decoration, bronze, mosaic, gold leaf, statues, paintings, stained glass, all of it meant to create this sense of the heaven that awaits us when we reach the end of our days. This interior work was done by a later generation, done in the Baroque style, but that was a style that Michelangelo in his last years had helped pioneer. When you walk around there, you get a sense that this is part of the completion of Michelangelo's lifelong vision to merge the Christian faith with the grandeur of the ancient world. You see some of the work's highlights, like his Pietà that he'd sculpted for Old St. Peter's 60 years before. But perhaps his greatest legacy, and the thing that people still marvel at today, is the dome that he placed over the tomb of St. Peter. Michelangelo in his lifetime did the designs and completed up about as much as we see here, about where the windows are. And his designs then were completed by later architects 2 generations later. From a distance, you get a real sense of the scale of this thing. A dome 448 feet tall that makes this the greatest church in Christendom. One of the best ways to finish a walk through St. Peter's is to climb up 323 sweaty steps inside the dome, where you pop out on top with this marvelous view of Rome. And from this high perspective, looking out over the eternal city, it's probably a good place for us to look back on what we have seen in our journey through Michelangelo's life. It started in inauspicious beginnings in his hometown in Florence, his education with the Medici, the Pietà that put him on the map, the triumph of David, and the exuberant, over-the-top nature of the Sistine Chapel, the lost years in the quarries of Carrara, and all of those unfinished projects. We saw Michelangelo as tourist, as lover, and the introspective religious works of his late years. Finally, there is the church that served as a model for so many that put a cap on the Renaissance. When Michelangelo died in 1564 at the age of 89, you could essentially say the Renaissance died with him. He was called Il Divino, the Divine One, by his contemporaries who thought that he had received his artistic talent as a divine spark from heaven. Michelangelo received that divine spark and passed it along to the next generations, and in the process, creating some of the most iconic images of the Western world. Well, thank you, grazie. I hope you have a real good trip.